The mountain highway twisted like a serpent through the Colorado Rockies, each curve revealing another breathtaking vista of snow-capped peaks and emerald valleys stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Route 82 was notorious among locals for its beauty and its danger, a ribbon of asphalt that had claimed more lives than anyone cared to count. But on this crisp October morning, with autumn leaves dancing in the thin mountain air, it seemed almost peaceful. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Michael Torres adjusted his rearview mirror and checked his watch. 7:15 on the dot. The charter bus hummed steadily beneath his weathered hands, its diesel engine purring like a contented cat as he navigated the familiar route. Behind him, 43 passengers settled into their seats, a mixture of excited chatter and sleepy murmurs filling the cabin. The Riverside High School marching band was heading to the state competition in Denver, their instruments carefully stowed in the luggage compartments below, their dreams riding on every note they'd practiced for months. He'd been driving this route for 8 years now, ever since he'd hung up his uniform and traded the cockpit for a steering wheel. Nobody knew about the other life he'd lived, the one where he'd worn captain's bars and commanded respect in the skies above Afghanistan and Iraq. To them, he was just Mike, the bus driver, the quiet single dad who showed up on time, drove safely, and never caused trouble. That's exactly how he wanted it. In the third row from the front, 16-year-old Sophie Martinez clutched her clarinet case and stared out the window. Her father had been deployed 3 times before she turned 10, and the sound of engines still made her nervous. She'd chosen the clarinet because it was quiet, gentle, nothing like the roar of the helicopters that had haunted her childhood nightmares. Her fingers traced the worn leather of the case, finding comfort in its familiar texture. "Hey Soph, you okay?" Her best friend Jenna slid into the seat beside her, her bright smile cutting through Sophie's anxiety like sunlight through clouds. "Just thinking about the performance," Sophie murmured, though they both knew it was more than that. The competition was important, but it wasn't what had her stomach in knots. Michael caught the exchange in his mirror and felt a familiar tug in his chest. He recognized that look, had seen it in his own daughter's eyes more times than he cared to remember. Maya was only 12 now, safe at home with his sister while he worked, but she carried the same weight that all military children did. The weight of worry, of never knowing when the next goodbye might be the last one. The bus climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner with each mile. Behind Michael, the chaperones were doing their best to keep 40 teenagers contained and entertained. Mrs. Henderson, the band director, reviewed her notes for the 100th time, her silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows. Mr. Parker, the assistant director, tried to mediate a heated discussion about who would sit where during the performance, but it was Dr. Victoria Ashworth who commanded attention without saying a word. The school superintendent sat in the front row, her perfectly pressed suit and calculating gaze, making it clear she was there for more than just moral support. The band program had been under scrutiny for budget cuts, and today's performance could determine its future. She'd made that abundantly clear in her speech to the students before they'd boarded. "Excellence isn't negotiable," she'd said, her voice crisp as mountain air. "We expect nothing less than perfection." Michael had watched the kids' faces fall at her words, their excitement dimming like a candle in the wind. He'd wanted to say something, anything, to restore their confidence, but he was just the bus driver. His job was to get them there safely, nothing more. The radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation. "All units be advised, weather conditions deteriorating rapidly in the high country. Visibility dropping, wind speeds increasing, exercise extreme caution." Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd flown through worse conditions than this, had landed planes in sandstorms and ice storms that would make grown men weep. But this was different. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about 43 souls who trusted him to get them home to their families. He glanced at the GPS display, noting their current elevation and the route ahead. They were climbing toward Independence Pass, one of the highest and most treacherous stretches of highway in Colorado. The weather could change in minutes up here, turning a beautiful morning into a deadly trap. As if summoned by his thoughts, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were light at first, dancing playfully across the windshield like tiny ballerinas. But Michael had learned to read the mountain's moods, and he didn't like what he was seeing. The wind was picking up, and those innocent flakes were growing larger, more aggressive. "Mr. Torres," Sophie's voice was small, uncertain. "Is everything okay?" He met her eyes in the mirror and forced a reassuring smile. "Just keeping an eye on the weather, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But even as he said the words, Michael was already running through contingency plans in his mind. There were several places they could turn around if conditions got worse, a few scenic overlooks where they could wait out the storm. He'd driven this route in all kinds of weather, knew every curve and straightaway like the back of his hand. What he didn't know was that 15 miles ahead, a massive oak tree, weakened by years of drought and beetle infestation, was swaying in the increasing wind. Its roots, no longer able to find purchase in the rocky soil, were slowly giving way. In 10 minutes, maybe 15, it would come crashing down across the highway, turning their morning journey into something none of them would ever forget. The bus continued its steady climb, carrying its precious cargo of dreams and hopes toward an encounter with destiny. In the back, Tommy Rodriguez adjusted his tuba case and wondered if his father would make it to the performance. His dad worked double shifts at the factory, trying to make ends meet since his mom had passed. The band was Tommy's escape, his way of honoring her memory through music. 3 rows up, Sarah Chen checked her phone for the 100th time, hoping for a message from her older brother. He was stationed overseas, and she'd promised to send him a video of their performance. He'd been the one to encourage her to stick with music when things got tough, when the other kids made fun of her for being different. Every student on that bus carried a story, a dream, a reason for being there. They trusted Michael Torres to get them to Denver safely, to help them chase their ambitions and make their families proud. They saw him as just a bus driver, a means to an end, someone who existed on the periphery of their important lives. They had no idea that the quiet man behind the wheel had once been responsible for bringing soldiers home from war zones, that he'd earned 3 distinguished flying crosses and a Bronze Star for his service. They didn't know about the nights he still woke up in cold sweats, remembering the missions that hadn't gone according to plan, the friends he'd lost, the weight of command that had finally become too much to bear. Michael had left the Air Force not because he'd lost his nerve, but because he'd found something more important than glory or career advancement. He'd found Maya, abandoned by her mother, and needing a father who would put her needs above his own ambitions. The choice hadn't been difficult, but the transition had been harder than he'd expected. Going from Captain Michael Torres, decorated fighter pilot and transport commander, to Mike the bus driver had required a complete reinvention of himself. He'd learned to find satisfaction in smaller victories, quieter moments of connection, like the way Sophie's face lit up when she mastered a difficult passage, or how Tommy's confidence had grown over the years, or the pride in Mrs. Henderson's eyes when her students performed well. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes no longer playful but purposeful, driven by winds that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Michael adjusted the windshield wipers and checked the temperature gauge, still within normal limits, but he could feel the bus working harder as they climbed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called over the intercom, his voice calm and reassuring, "we're experiencing some weather up ahead. I'm going to ask everyone to make sure their seatbelts are fastened and to secure any loose items. It's just a precaution." Dr. Ashworth looked up from her tablet, her expression sharp with concern. "Driver, perhaps we should consider turning back. We can't afford any delays." Michael met her gaze in the mirror, noting the way she said driver like it was beneath her to learn his name. "We're still within safe parameters, ma'am. I'll keep monitoring the situation. These children's futures are at stake," she continued, her voice carrying that authoritative tone that had intimidated countless educators over the years. "We cannot miss this competition, and I'll make sure we don't." Michael replied quietly, "Safety first, though, Doctor." Ashworth's lips pursed in disapproval, but she returned to her tablet. She'd built her career on results, on pushing people to exceed their limitations. In her world, obstacles were meant to be overcome, not accommodated. The fact that a simple bus driver was questioning her priorities rankled her more than she cared to admit. The radio crackled again, this time with an update that made Michael's blood run cold. "All units, weather station reporting whiteout conditions, developing rapidly in the Independence Pass area. Recommend extreme caution or alternative routes." Michael's mind immediately went to the map he'd memorized years ago. There were two ways to reach Denver from their current position. They could continue on Route 82, which was faster but would take them directly into the storm, or they could backtrack 15 miles and take the longer route through the valley. The valley route would add 2 hours to their trip, making them late for the competition check-in. He could feel Dr. Ashworth's eyes boring into the back of his head, could sense the weight of 43 people's expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. In the cockpit, decisions like this had been clearer somehow. The mission parameters were defined, the risks calculated, the chain of command established, but this wasn't a military operation. These weren't soldiers trained to accept the dangers of their chosen profession. They were kids, teenagers with their whole lives ahead of them, trusting him to make the right choice. The snow was really coming down now, the visibility dropping by the minute. Michael could feel the bus start to struggle for traction on the increasingly slick pavement. His years of experience told him they were approaching the point of no return, the moment when a cautious retreat would become impossible. Behind him, some of the students had noticed the deteriorating conditions. Conversations grew quieter, and more faces turned toward the windows with growing concern. Sarah Chen put away her phone, no longer interested in social media updates. Tommy Rodriguez instinctively tightened his grip on his tuba case. Sophie Martinez began to hum softly, a habit she'd developed as a child to calm her nerves during her father's deployments. Mrs. Henderson made her way to the front of the bus, her experienced eyes taking in the situation at a glance. "Michael," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time in all the years they'd worked together, "what do you think?" He appreciated that she asked, that she treated him like a professional whose opinion mattered. "It's getting dicey, Helen. If we turn back now, we can take the valley route. We'll be late, but we'll be safe. And if we continue..." Michael studied the road ahead, watching the way the snow swirled and danced in the wind, noting how the trees bent under the increasing pressure. His pilot's instincts were screaming warnings, telling him to abort, to find an alternative. But he also knew what this competition meant to these kids, how hard they'd worked, how much they'd sacrificed. "If we continue," he said slowly, "we're committed. Once we start the descent into the pass, there's no turning around until we reach the other side." Mrs. Henderson nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. She'd been teaching for 35 years, had seen how opportunities like this could change a young person's life. But she'd also seen how quickly things could go wrong, how a single moment of poor judgment could have consequences that lasted forever. "It's your call, Michael," she said softly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We trust you." Those 4 words hit him harder than any commendation or medal ever had. "We trust you. Not we're depending on you, not you have no choice, but we trust you." It was a gift and a burden, a recognition of his expertise and an acknowledgement of his humanity. Michael took a deep breath, his hands steady on the wheel despite the chaos raging in his mind.
He thought of Maya, safe at home with his sister, probably getting ready for school. He'd promised her he'd be home for dinner, that they'd work on her science project together. He thought of his own father, lost in a plane crash when Michael was barely older than these kids, and the way that loss had shaped every decision he'd made since. But mostly, he thought about the 43 people behind him, each one somebody's child, somebody's hope for the future. Tommy, whose father worked himself to exhaustion to give his son opportunities. Sarah, whose brother was fighting overseas. Sophie, who carried the invisible scars of military life. They all deserved to chase their dreams, but not at the cost of their lives. The decision crystallized in his mind with sudden, perfect clarity. He began to slow the bus, looking for a place to safely turn around. The valley route would have to do. They'd arrive late, might miss the first performance slot, but they'd arrive alive. That's when the tree came down. It happened with shocking suddenness, a massive oak that had stood sentinel over the highway for over a century, finally surrendering to the wind. The sound was like thunder, a crack that echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the grinding crash of wood against asphalt. Michael had perhaps 2 seconds to react, 2 heartbeats to process what was happening and respond. His pilot training kicked in immediately, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Time seemed to slow as he assessed the situation, calculated angles and speeds and probabilities. The tree had fallen directly across their path, completely blocking the road. There was nowhere to go but over the edge, but Michael Torres had spent years learning to land aircraft in impossible situations, to find solutions when all conventional options were exhausted. As the bus left the pavement and began its terrifying plunge down the mountainside, carrying its cargo of dreams and fears into the unknown, his mind was already working on the problem of how to bring them all home safely. The last thing the passengers heard before the world turned upside down was their bus driver's voice, calm and steady as a summer morning, coming over the intercom. "Hold on tight, everyone. We're going to be okay." The world had turned into a kaleidoscope of terror and physics. The charter bus careened down the steep mountainside, bouncing off boulders and scraping against pine trees that reached out like gnarled fingers trying to slow their descent. Metal groaned against metal as the vehicle's frame twisted and flexed under forces it was never designed to endure. Inside the cabin, screams mixed with the sound of shattering glass and the terrible grinding of the transmission as Michael Torres fought to maintain some semblance of control over their plummeting fate. His hands moved across the steering wheel with surgical precision, every micro-adjustment calculated to keep them upright, to prevent the bus from rolling over and crushing everyone inside. Years of flying transport planes had taught him that when conventional navigation failed, you relied on instinct, on the fundamental principles of physics and momentum. The bus was an aircraft now, albeit one without wings, subject to the same laws of gravity and inertia that governed every machine that moved through 3-dimensional space. The screaming behind him was getting worse. He could hear Mrs. Henderson's voice cutting through the chaos, trying to keep the students calm, trying to maintain order in a situation where order had ceased to exist. Dr. Ashworth's authoritative commands had devolved into panicked shouts that nobody could understand over the din of destruction. But it was Sophie Martinez's voice that cut through everything else, a high, keening wail that spoke of pure primal terror. Michael's mind split into 2 distinct channels. The first channel was pure calculation, processing the angle of descent, the speed of their fall, the obstacles ahead. A cluster of aspens coming up fast on the left, a granite outcropping that could either stop them or kill them depending on how they hit it. The tree line thinning as they approached what looked like a clearing, though from this angle and at this speed it was impossible to tell what lay beyond the edge of visibility. The second channel was memory, flooding back with the clarity that only comes in moments of absolute crisis. Afghanistan, 2019, his C-130 Hercules transport loaded with 37 wounded soldiers, both engines failing simultaneously over the Hindu Kush Mountains. The radio filled with static, ground control lost, nothing but hostile territory below, and a crew that looked to him for miracles he wasn't sure he could deliver. He'd brought that plane down in a controlled crash landing on a stretch of desert that wasn't much bigger than a football field. 37 soldiers went home to their families because he'd refused to accept that some situations were hopeless. The Bronze Star citation had called it extraordinary heroism under fire, but Michael knew better. It hadn't been heroism at all. It had been stubborn refusal to let good people die on his watch. The bus hit a large boulder and went airborne for 3 terrifying seconds. In that moment of weightlessness, time seemed suspended, and Michael could hear every individual sound inside the cabin. Tommy Rodriguez was praying in Spanish, his voice steady despite the chaos. Sarah Chen was calling for her mother. Someone in the back was vomiting, the sound sharp and immediate, but underneath it all was a different sound, something that made his chest tighten with recognition and hope. Sophie Martinez had stopped screaming. Instead, she was humming. It was barely audible over the mechanical chaos, but Michael's trained ear caught it immediately. A simple melody, repetitive and soothing, the kind of tune a child might use to comfort themselves in the dark. She was doing what military personnel did under extreme stress, finding something familiar and stable to anchor themselves when everything else had gone to hell. The bus crashed back to earth with a bone-jarring impact that sent sparks flying from the undercarriage. Michael felt something in his left shoulder give way, a sharp pain that he immediately compartmentalized and ignored. There would be time for injury assessment later, assuming there was a later. Right now, his entire focus had to be on the physics problem in front of him. They were approaching the granite outcropping, a wall of stone that rose 30 feet into the air like a monument to immovable objects. If they hit it head-on at this speed, the bus would crumple like a beer can and everyone inside would die instantly. But there was a gap, a narrow passage between the main face and a smaller formation to the right. It was maybe 20 feet wide, barely enough clearance for the bus if he could thread the needle perfectly. The problem was their trajectory. They were coming in too steep and too far to the left. In an aircraft he could adjust with the rudder, use the elevators to change their angle of attack. But a bus falling down a mountain followed different rules, responded to different inputs. He had the steering wheel and the brakes, both of limited utility when your vehicle was essentially in freefall. Michael made a decision that went against every instinct screaming in his head. Instead of braking, which would only slow them down and guarantee they'd hit the main face of the outcropping, he pressed the accelerator. The engine roared in protest, but their speed increased, and more importantly, their trajectory shifted. The additional momentum carried them further to the right, directly toward the narrow gap he'd identified. Behind him, Dr. Ashworth's voice cut through the pandemonium with crystalline authority. "What are you doing? Slow down. You're going to kill us all." Michael didn't respond. He couldn't afford the distraction. The gap was rushing toward them at 70 miles per hour, and he had perhaps 5 seconds to make final adjustments. The steering wheel fought against his grip as the front wheels bounced off rocks and roots, but he held firm, making minute corrections that would either save their lives or end them all in a spectacular display of miscalculation. They shot through the gap with less than 3 feet of clearance on either side. The passenger side mirror exploded as it clipped the rock face, showering the cabin with glass fragments. But they were through, still upright, still moving. The victory lasted exactly 4 seconds, until Michael saw what lay ahead. The clearing he'd glimpsed from above wasn't a meadow or a flat space suitable for landing. It was a ravine, a deep cut in the earth that dropped away into shadow and uncertainty. The bus was going to go over the edge, and this time there would be no physics calculations to save them. This time they would simply fall until they hit bottom, however far down that might be. But Michael Torres had one more trick up his sleeve, one more desperate gambit born from years of bringing damaged aircraft home against impossible odds. As they approached the edge of the ravine, he cranked the steering wheel hard to the right and engaged the emergency brake with his foot. The bus went into a controlled skid, its rear end swinging around as momentum carried them forward. Instead of plunging nose first into the ravine, they were now sliding sideways toward the edge. It was still going to be a fall, but the physics were different now. If he could time it exactly right, if he could get the bus to tilt just enough, they might slide down the side of the ravine instead of dropping straight down. It was the difference between a controlled crash landing and a catastrophic impact. The bus teetered on the edge for a heart-stopping moment, balanced perfectly between salvation and disaster. Michael could feel the suspension groaning under the stress, could hear the creaking of metal pushed beyond its design limits. Then gravity made the decision for them, and they began to slide down the steep wall of the ravine. It was like riding a landslide in reverse. The bus scraped and bounced against the rocky slope, leaving a trail of metal and rubber in its wake. But they were sliding, not falling, maintaining some degree of contact with the earth instead of simply dropping through empty air. Michael fought to keep the wheels pointed downhill, to prevent them from catching on an obstruction that would flip them over. The angle was steep, maybe 45 degrees, and getting steeper. Through the fractured windshield, he could see water at the bottom of the ravine, a narrow stream that wound through the rocky floor like a silver ribbon. If they could make it to the bottom without flipping over, if the stream wasn't too deep, if the ground was soft enough to absorb some of their remaining momentum, they might actually survive this. That's when the screaming stopped. Not because the danger had passed, but because everyone in the bus had reached that point of terror where the mind simply shuts down, where conscious thought becomes impossible and survival instincts take over completely. Even Dr. Ashworth had gone silent, her face pale as parchment as she gripped her seat with white knuckles. But Sophie Martinez was still humming, louder now, as if the melody was the only thing keeping her tethered to sanity. Other voices began to join her, tentatively at first, then with growing strength. Tommy Rodriguez's deep voice added a bass line to her simple tune. Sarah Chen's clear soprano wove harmonies above the melody. Mrs. Henderson, despite her own terror, began to conduct with one hand while holding on with the other. Michael found himself humming along as well, the familiar discipline of music providing structure in a situation where everything else had collapsed into chaos. He'd always believed that humans were at their best when they were creating something together, when they found ways to connect across the barriers of fear and circumstance. The fact that these kids could find music in the middle of a disaster spoke to something unbreakable in the human spirit. The bus hit a series of embedded boulders that acted like brake pads, slowing their descent but also threatening to flip them over with each jarring impact. Michael rode each collision like a wave, adjusting their angle of descent, using the steering wheel to keep them oriented properly. His shoulder was screaming in pain now, probably dislocated, but his hands remained steady on the wheel. They were 3/4 of the way down the ravine wall when disaster struck again. The right front wheel caught in a crevice between two rocks, and the bus lurched violently to the right. For a terrifying moment, Michael thought they were going to flip over, but the wheel broke free with a grinding shriek of torn metal. However, the damage was done. They were no longer sliding in a controlled manner, but tumbling end over end toward the bottom of the ravine. The world became a blur of sky and earth, metal and stone, screaming and silence. Michael's training told him to brace for impact, to protect his head and neck, to prepare for the inevitable collision that would either knock him unconscious or kill him outright. But his instincts as a pilot told him something different. Even in a tumbling aircraft, even when all control surfaces had failed, there were sometimes split-second opportunities to regain control. As the bus completed its first full rotation and briefly returned to an upright position, Michael saw his chance. The steering wheel was still in his hands, the brakes still responsive despite the damage to the chassis. He had perhaps 2 seconds before they flipped again, 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether they landed right side up or upside down when they finally hit bottom. He yanked the wheel hard left and floored the accelerator, using their remaining momentum to complete a second rotation instead of allowing them to flip chaotically. The engine died with a grinding cough, and suddenly the world was eerily quiet, except for the gentle sound of the stream flowing nearby, and the soft hissing of steam from the destroyed radiator. For a long moment, nobody moved. Everyone was waiting for the next disaster, the next indication that their ordeal wasn't over. But the bus remained motionless, settled into the rocky stream bed like a wounded animal that had finally found a place to rest. Michael's hands shook as he released the steering wheel. Every muscle in his body was screaming in protest. His shoulder was definitely dislocated, and he was pretty sure he had at least 3 cracked ribs. But he was alive. More importantly, he could hear voices behind him, which meant his passengers were alive too. "Is everyone okay, Mrs.?" Henderson's voice was shaky but authoritative, the natural response of someone trained to take charge in emergencies. "Sound off by seat number. Row 1, are you all right?" The responses came back in a mixture of languages and emotional states, but they came back. Scared voices, crying voices, voices thick with shock and adrenaline, but voices nonetheless. Michael closed his eyes and allowed himself one moment of gratitude before the reality of their situation crashed down on him like a second avalanche. They were alive, but they were also trapped at the bottom of a ravine in the Colorado Rockies, with a destroyed bus, no communication with the outside world, and a snowstorm that was only getting worse. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and several of the students were already showing signs of shock and hypothermia. They needed shelter, they needed medical attention, and they needed rescue. But most importantly, they needed someone to take charge, someone who could make the hard decisions that would keep them alive until help arrived. As Michael Torres unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly turned to face his passengers, he realized that his days of hiding behind the anonymous identity of just the bus driver were officially over. Victoria Ashworth was the first to speak, her voice sharp with accusation despite her obvious shock. "This is your fault. You should have turned back when I told you to. You should have taken the safe route. Now look what's happened." Michael met her gaze steadily, noting the way her perfectly applied makeup had run with tears of fear, the way her expensive suit was torn and stained with dirt. She was looking for someone to blame, someone to absorb the responsibility for their current situation. A week ago, he might have accepted that blame, might have retreated into the comfortable anonymity of being just a hired driver who'd made a mistake. But something had changed during their terrifying descent down the mountainside. Something had shifted in the moment when he'd chosen to accelerate toward the rock formation instead of braking, when he'd made the split-second decision to trust his pilot's instincts over conventional wisdom. He wasn't just a bus driver anymore. He was Captain Michael Torres again, and these people were his responsibility. "Dr. Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made several of the students look up in surprise. "Right now, blame isn't going to keep us warm or get us rescued. We need to focus on survival." She started to argue, but Michael had already turned away, his attention focused on the more immediate problems facing them. The bus was tilted at an uncomfortable angle, with the left side higher than the right. Several windows were shattered, allowing cold air and snow to blow into the passenger compartment. The heating system was obviously not working, and the emergency exits were blocked by debris and twisted metal. "Mrs. Henderson," he called, noting how the band director was moving efficiently from seat to seat, checking on her students. "What's our injury situation?" She paused in her assessment and looked back at him with new respect. Something in his tone, his demeanor, had changed. This wasn't the quiet, deferential bus driver who'd helped load their instruments that morning. This was someone accustomed to command, someone who expected to be obeyed. "3 students with what appear to be broken bones," she reported crisply. "Several cases of cuts and bruises, everyone showing signs of shock to some degree. Sarah Chen has a head wound that's bleeding pretty badly, and Tommy Rodriguez is complaining of chest pain." Michael nodded, his mind already working through triage protocols he'd learned in military medical training. Can you get me a full count of who's conscious and responsive, and check the emergency kit under my seat? There should be basic medical supplies. As Mrs. Henderson moved to carry out his instructions, Michael turned his attention to the physical challenges they faced. The bus was wrecked beyond any possibility of driving, even if they could somehow get it back up to the road. But it was also their shelter, their protection from the elements. With some work, they might be able to seal the broken windows and create a survivable environment until rescue arrived. The problem was that rescue might be a long time coming. They'd gone off the road in a remote area during a snowstorm, and their exact location would be difficult to determine from above. Search and rescue teams would be looking, but they'd be starting from the last known position on the highway, not the bottom of an unnamed ravine a quarter-mile away, which meant they needed to prepare for an extended stay in conditions that were rapidly becoming life-threatening. Michael climbed carefully over the tilted seats toward the back of the bus, noting how some of the students tracked his movement with new attention. Word was spreading that their mild-mannered driver was somehow different than they'd assumed, that he seemed to know what he was doing in a way that went beyond basic first aid training. The luggage compartments were severely damaged, but some of them were still accessible. Inside, he found the band's instrument cases, most of them cracked or bent but still intact. More importantly, he found the emergency supplies that any responsible charter bus was required to carry: blankets, water, some basic food supplies, and a comprehensive first aid kit. "Sophie," he called to the girl who'd been humming during their descent, "I need you to help distribute these blankets. Start with anyone who's shivering or showing signs of shock." She looked up at him with wide eyes, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but she nodded and took the blankets he handed her. There was something in his voice that cut through her fear, something that suggested he'd been in situations like this before and knew how to handle them. As Sophie moved through the bus distributing blankets, Michael continued his assessment of their resources and challenges. The stream running alongside the bus was both an asset and a liability. It provided fresh water, which they'd need if their stay was extended, but it also meant the temperature at the bottom of the ravine would be significantly colder than on the road above. The rocky walls of the ravine provided some protection from the wind, but they also created an echo chamber that would make it difficult for rescue aircraft to locate them by sound. Worst of all, the depth of the ravine meant that radio signals would have trouble reaching them, making communication with the outside world nearly impossible. Tommy Rodriguez was sitting in his seat, one arm cradled against his chest, his face pale with pain. Michael knelt beside him, his movements gentle but authoritative. "Let me take a look at that," he said, carefully examining the way Tommy held his arm. "Does it hurt when you breathe?" Tommy nodded, wincing as he tried to take a deeper breath. "Feels like something's pressing on my chest." Michael's hands moved with practiced skill, checking for obvious fractures or signs of internal injury. His medical training was limited to battlefield first aid, but he'd seen enough combat injuries to recognize the symptoms of broken ribs and possible internal trauma. "I think you've got some cracked ribs," he told Tommy quietly. "We're going to immobilize that arm and make sure you stay as comfortable as possible. But I need you to tell me immediately if the pain gets worse or if you have trouble breathing." As he worked, Michael became aware that he had an audience. Other students were watching him work, noting the confident way he handled medical procedures, the authoritative tone he used when giving instructions. Dr. Ashworth, too, was watching with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, her voice still sharp but less accusatory than before. Michael didn't look up from his work with Tommy. "Military training," he said simply. The two words hung in the air like a revelation. Suddenly, a lot of things began to make sense to the people watching him. The way he'd maintained control of the bus during their terrifying descent. The calm authority with which he was now taking charge of their survival. The systematic way he was approaching problems that would have overwhelmed most civilian drivers. Sarah Chen raised her hand tentatively, the bloody bandage on her forehead making her look younger than her 16 years. "Were you a soldier?" Michael finished securing Tommy's arm in a makeshift sling before answering. "Air Force," he said. "Transport pilot and medical evacuation. Retired." Mrs. Henderson stared at him with new understanding. "That's how you knew what to do with the bus. You've landed damaged aircraft before." Michael nodded, but his attention was already moving to the next problem. The temperature inside the bus was dropping rapidly, and several of the students were beginning to shiver uncontrollably despite the blankets. They needed to find a way to generate heat, and they needed to do it soon. The engine was dead, which meant no heat from the bus's climate control system. But the engine compartment might still retain some residual heat, and there were other ways to generate warmth if they were creative about it. "I need 3 volunteers," Michael announced, his voice carrying easily through the damaged bus. "People who aren't injured and can work with their hands. We're going to weatherproof this bus and turn it into a survival shelter." Hands went up immediately. Despite their fear and shock, the students were responding to his leadership, recognizing that he offered their best hope of survival. Even Dr. Ashworth, despite her obvious resentment at being superseded by a mere bus driver, had stopped arguing and started helping. For the next 2 hours, they worked together with desperate efficiency. Using luggage, instrument cases and torn seat cushions, they sealed the broken windows and created insulation barriers. The stream provided water for cleaning wounds and a source of drinking water if properly filtered. Most importantly, they found ways to generate heat using body warmth, shared blankets, and even the friction created by rubbing hands together in coordinated exercises. Michael moved through it all like a conductor leading an orchestra, assigning tasks based on individual capabilities, monitoring the medical condition of the injured students, maintaining morale through a combination of clear communication and steady confidence. The scared, quiet bus driver had completely disappeared, replaced by a military officer who'd spent years keeping people alive in hostile environments. As the short winter day faded into darkness, the true test of their survival was just beginning. The temperature continued to drop, the snow continued to fall, and there was still no sign of rescue. But inside the battered charter bus, 43 people had found something they hadn't expected to find in the middle of disaster. They'd found a leader, and that leader was just getting started. Dawn broke gray and cold over the ravine, filtering through the heavy clouds like weak tea through cheesecloth. Michael Torres had been awake for most of the night, monitoring the condition of his passengers, checking makeshift bandages, and listening for the sound of rescue helicopters that never came. The improvised shelter they'd created inside the wrecked bus had kept everyone alive through the bitter mountain night, but barely. Several of the students were showing advanced signs of hypothermia, and their water supply was running dangerously low. Outside, the snowfall had stopped, but the accumulation was significant. At least 18 inches had fallen during the night, creating a pristine white blanket that effectively erased any trace of their presence from the world above. The ravine walls, which had seemed merely steep yesterday, now appeared insurmountable under their coating of snow and ice. Michael moved quietly through the bus, checking on each passenger systematically. His dislocated shoulder throbbed with every movement, but he'd learned long ago to compartmentalize physical pain when lives were at stake. Tommy Rodriguez was breathing easier this morning, though his complexion still had the waxy pallor of someone fighting internal injuries. Sarah Chen's head wound had stopped bleeding, but she was showing signs of concussion that concerned him. Most worrying was elderly Mr. Jamieson, the volunteer chaperone who'd been helping with equipment, whose lips had taken on a bluish tinge that suggested serious circulatory problems. Dr.
Victoria Ashworth had appointed herself as his unofficial deputy during the night, though her authoritative demeanor had softened considerably in the face of their shared crisis.
She approached him now with a clipboard she'd salvaged from the wreckage, her usually perfect hair disheveled and her designer suit wrinkled beyond recognition. "I've done an inventory of our supplies," she reported quietly, keeping her voice low so as not to wake the sleeping students. "We have enough food for maybe 2 more days if we ration carefully. Water for 3 days, assuming we can keep melting snow. But Michael," she paused, using his first name for the first time since he'd known her. "Some of these kids aren't going to make it much longer without real medical attention." Michael nodded grimly. He'd reached the same conclusion during his own assessment. The combination of injuries, exposure, and psychological trauma was creating a cascade of medical problems that his limited field training couldn't address indefinitely. They needed rescue, and they needed it soon. "What about communication?" he asked. "Any luck with the radios, Doctor?" Ashworth shook her head. "The emergency radio was damaged in the crash. Cell phones can't get a signal down here. We're completely cut off." Michael absorbed this information without visible reaction, though inside his mind was already working through alternatives. In his military experience, rescue missions often failed not because of lack of effort, but because of miscommunication about location and circumstances. Search and rescue teams would be looking for them, but they'd be concentrating their efforts along the highway where the bus had gone off the road. The idea that they might have survived a quarter-mile tumble down into a hidden ravine would seem impossible to most civilian rescue coordinators, which meant they couldn't simply wait to be found. They were going to have to make themselves findable. Mrs. Henderson approached from the back of the bus, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Michael, I'm concerned about Sophie Martinez. She's been talking to herself all night, and she keeps asking for her father. I think she might be having some kind of psychological break." Michael followed Mrs. Henderson to where Sophie sat curled in a corner seat, wrapped in multiple blankets but still shivering. Her eyes had a glassy, unfocused quality that he recognized from soldiers who'd been pushed beyond their psychological breaking point. She was humming again, but this time the melody was fragmented, interrupted by whispered conversations with people who weren't there. "Sophie," he said gently, settling into the seat across from her. "How are you feeling this morning?" She looked at him with sudden clarity, as if his voice had pulled her back from wherever her mind had been wandering. "Captain Torres," she said, surprising him with the title he hadn't used in years. "My father always said that when you're lost you should stay in one place and make yourself easy to find. But what if the people looking for you don't know where to look?" The question was more lucid than he'd expected, and it cut directly to the heart of their problem. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "you have to give them a reason to look in the right place." Sophie nodded solemnly, "Like a signal fire, or a mirror, reflecting sunlight. Something that says here we are loud enough for them to hear." Michael felt a spark of inspiration. Sophie's fever-induced clarity had just given him an idea that might save all their lives. But it would require taking an enormous risk, leaving the relative safety of their shelter to venture out into the hostile environment of the snow-covered mountains. He stood and addressed the group in a voice that carried the quiet authority they'd come to expect from him. "I need to talk to everyone about our situation. I know you're all scared, and you have every right to be. But I want you to understand that we're not helpless, and we're not forgotten. Right now there are search and rescue teams looking for us. The problem is they're looking in the wrong place." A murmur of concern rippled through the survivors. Dr. Ashworth frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we can't wait for them to find us by accident. We need to signal our location in a way that can be seen from the air." Michael gestured toward the narrow opening at the top of the ravine. "Up there on the rim, we could create a signal that would be visible to search aircraft from miles away." Tommy Rodriguez raised his good hand tentatively. "But Captain, how would we get up there? Those walls are almost vertical." Michael had been studying the ravine walls since dawn, noting potential climbing routes, identifying handholds and ledges that might support a person's weight. "It's not impossible," he said. "Difficult, dangerous, but not impossible. The east wall has a natural path that switchbacks up through the rock formations. With proper equipment and technique, one person could make the climb. The implication of his words settled over the group like a cold wind. Mrs. Henderson was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "You're talking about leaving us, about going up there alone." "Not leaving," Michael corrected. "Scouting, creating a signal that will bring help to all of us. But yes, it would mean someone has to make the climb alone." Dr. Ashworth's voice was sharp with alarm. "That's suicide. You're injured, exhausted, and you'd be climbing in snow and ice conditions. Even if you made it to the top, which is doubtful, you'd be exposed to the elements with no shelter." Michael had already considered all of these factors. The risks were enormous, and the chances of success were marginal at best. But the alternative was to remain hidden at the bottom of the ravine while his passengers slowly succumbed to cold, hunger, and untreated injuries. From a tactical standpoint, the choice was clear. "Dr. Ashworth is right about the risks," he admitted, "but she's also right about what happens if we do nothing. Some of you won't survive another night down here. Mr. Jameson needs immediate medical attention. Sarah's concussion is getting worse, not better, and our food and water won't last beyond tomorrow." Sarah Chen spoke up from her position near the front of the bus, her voice weak but determined. "What kind of signal would you make? How would search planes see it?" Michael had been thinking about this problem since Sophie's comment about signal fires. The snow up on the rim will be pristine, untouched. Against that white background, almost anything dark would be visible from the air. I could use debris from the bus, arrange it in a pattern that clearly indicates human presence. Better yet, if I could get some of the darker clothing, create contrast patterns that spell out SOS or point toward our location. The plan was taking shape as he spoke, becoming more concrete and feasible. Tommy Rodriguez looked thoughtful despite his obvious pain. "What about smoke? Could you start a signal fire?" "Possible," Michael acknowledged. "But fire is unpredictable in these conditions, and the smoke might not be visible against the overcast sky. Visual markers on the snow would be more reliable." Mrs. Henderson had been quiet during this exchange, but now she stood with the decisive air of someone who'd made up her mind. "I'm going with you." "Helen, no." Michael's response was immediate and firm. "You're needed here. These kids trust you, and if something goes wrong with my climb, they'll need your leadership. And you'll need someone to help carry supplies, someone to assist if you're injured during the ascent." Her voice carried the same stubborn determination that had made her an effective band director for 3 decades. "I've been rock climbing since I was 20 years old. I know these mountains, and I know my limitations. More importantly, I know that your chances of success double if you're not doing this alone." Michael started to argue, but Dr. Ashworth surprised everyone by supporting Mrs. Henderson's proposal. "She's right. From a tactical standpoint, a 2-person team has much better odds than a solo attempt. Helen knows the local terrain, and she's in better physical condition than you are right now." The debate that followed was intense but brief. In the end, Michael had to acknowledge that Mrs. Henderson's participation significantly improved their chances of success. She was uninjured, experienced in mountain conditions, and respected by the students in a way that would maintain group morale during their absence. The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. They gathered everything that might be useful for the climb: rope fashioned from seatbelt webbing, makeshift tools created from bus parts, dark clothing and materials for creating the signal array. Most importantly, they established clear protocols for what the remaining survivors should do if the rescue attempt failed. Dr. Ashworth would be in charge during their absence, with specific instructions for rationing supplies, monitoring the condition of injured passengers, and maintaining group discipline. If Michael and Mrs. Henderson weren't back within 24 hours, the group was to assume they'd been lost and begin preparing for a longer-term survival situation. Sophie Martinez had regained much of her mental clarity during the morning, and she approached Michael just before he prepared to begin the climb. "Captain, I want you to take this with you." She held out a small silver compass that had belonged to her father during his military service. Michael accepted the compass with appropriate solemnity. "This will help me find my way back to you," he promised. "It's not just for navigation," Sophie said quietly. "My father always said that when you carry something that belongs to home, it reminds you of what you're fighting to get back to." The climb began at what Michael estimated was approximately 10 in the morning, though the overcast sky made precise time determination difficult.
The first 50 feet were the most treacherous, requiring them to traverse loose scree and snow-covered rocks that shifted dangerously under their weight. Henderson proved to be as skilled as she'd claimed, moving with the steady confidence of someone who'd spent years navigating challenging terrain. The improvised rope system they'd devised worked better than expected. By securing one end to solid anchor points and using it to belay each other up the steeper sections, they were able to maintain safety margins that would have been impossible in a solo climb. Even so, the ascent was exhausting work, requiring frequent rest stops and careful route finding to avoid loose rock and ice formations. Halfway up the ravine wall, they encountered their first serious obstacle. A vertical section of smooth granite stretched 20 feet above them, offering no obvious handholds or footholds. Michael studied the barrier with growing concern, noting how the rock face was slick with ice that would make even expert-level climbing techniques extremely dangerous. Mrs. Henderson, however, had spotted something he'd missed. There, she pointed to a narrow ledge system that angled across the face, barely visible under its coating of snow. "It's not much, but if we can traverse to that outcropping, there's a chimney formation that should take us past this section." The traverse was terrifying, requiring them to edge sideways across the narrow ledge with nothing but empty space below them. Michael's injured shoulder screamed in protest with every movement, but he forced himself to maintain focus on the immediate task of foot placement and balance. One mistake here would mean a fatal fall back to the bottom of the ravine. They made it across the traverse and up through the chimney formation, emerging onto a wider ledge that offered their first real rest opportunity since beginning the climb. From this vantage point, they could see the full scope of their situation with devastating clarity. The ravine was far deeper than it had appeared from below, and their wrecked bus looked like a child's toy from this height. More concerning, the rim was still at least 100 feet above them, and the remaining route appeared to be the steepest section yet. But they could also see something that filled them with desperate hope. In the distance, barely visible through the overcast sky, a helicopter was conducting a search pattern along the highway above. It was too far away to signal, but its presence confirmed that rescue efforts were actively underway. "They're looking for us," Mrs. Henderson breathed. "We just have to make sure they find us." The final section of the climb tested every technique they'd learned during the ascent. The rock face was nearly vertical, requiring them to use advanced mountaineering skills with improvised equipment. Michael's military training in combat climbing served them well, but Mrs. Henderson's experience with recreational rock climbing proved equally valuable. Together, they solved problems that would have been insurmountable for either one alone. When they finally hauled themselves over the rim of the ravine and collapsed onto level ground, they were both near the limits of their endurance. The climb had taken over 4 hours, and the late afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. They had perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining to create their signal and begin attracting search aircraft to their location. The view from the rim was both magnificent and sobering. They could see for miles in every direction, across snow-covered peaks and valleys that stretched endlessly toward distant horizons. But they could also see how isolated their position was, how easily a search team could miss their location, even with the best intentions and equipment. Michael immediately began surveying the area for the best site to construct their signal array. The rim of the ravine was exposed to wind and weather, but it was also the highest point in the immediate area, making it ideal for visibility from aircraft. Using the dark materials they'd brought from the bus, supplemented by rocks and debris they found on the rim, they began constructing a massive arrow that pointed directly toward their location in the ravine below. Henderson proved to be invaluable in this effort, her artistic background helping them design a signal pattern that would be unmistakable from the air.
The arrow was 20 feet long and clearly visible against the white snow, but they supplemented it with additional markers that spelled out SOS and 43 alive in letters large enough to be read from a significant altitude. As they worked, they could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors moving through the search pattern. Twice, aircraft passed close enough that they might have been visible, but the helicopters continued on their predetermined routes without indication that they'd spotted the signal. The sun was getting low when they finally completed their work. The signal array was as visible and unmistakable as they could make it with available materials, but Michael realized they needed something more immediate, something that would attract attention right now, rather than hoping for a future search pattern to discover their markers. That's when Mrs. Henderson produced a small mirror from her personal effects. "Signal mirror," she explained. "I always carry one when I'm hiking in the mountains." Michael took the mirror with growing excitement. With the western sun still visible through breaks in the clouds, they could use reflected light to signal directly to aircraft. It was a technique he'd learned in survival training, but had never expected to use in a civilian rescue situation. The next helicopter appeared just as Michael was getting the angle right for the mirror reflection. The aircraft was perhaps 2 miles away, following the highway in a standard search pattern, but it was heading in their general direction. Michael began flashing the mirror in the standard SOS pattern: 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes, repeating the sequence continuously as the helicopter approached. For agonizing minutes, it seemed like the signal was being ignored. The helicopter maintained its course and altitude, showing no indication that the crew had noticed their desperate attempts to attract attention. Michael's arm was cramping from holding the mirror at the proper angle, but he refused to stop the signaling sequence. Then suddenly, the helicopter changed course. It banked sharply toward their position, losing altitude as it approached the rim of the ravine. Michael and Mrs. Henderson began waving frantically, jumping up and down, doing everything they could to confirm that they were indeed the source of the signal. The helicopter circled their position twice before hovering over the signal array they'd constructed. Through the aircraft's windows, they could see crew members pointing toward the markers, obviously understanding what they'd found. A loudspeaker crackled to life as the helicopter settled into a stable hover. "Survivors on the ground, this is Colorado Search and Rescue. We see your signal. Are you from the missing charter bus?" Michael cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back, though he knew they couldn't hear him over the rotor noise. Instead, he held up 4 fingers, then 3 fingers, then pointed emphatically toward the ravine below. The message was clear: 43 people down there need immediate assistance. The helicopter crew acknowledged with a thumbs-up gesture from one of the windows. The aircraft then moved to a position directly over the ravine, where crew members could see the wrecked bus and the survivors, who were now visible outside the vehicle, waving and signaling frantically from the bottom of the canyon. What followed was a carefully orchestrated rescue operation that took the rest of the daylight and continued well into the night. The helicopter crew called in additional aircraft and ground teams, establishing a complex extraction protocol that would safely remove all 43 survivors from their precarious position. The most seriously injured passengers were evacuated first, lifted out of the ravine in wire baskets suspended from the hovering helicopters. Tommy Rodriguez, Sarah Chen, and Mr. Jameson were among the first to be transported to medical facilities, their conditions stabilized by paramedics who rappelled down into the ravine to provide immediate care. Michael was one of the last to be evacuated, insisting that he remain until every student and chaperone had been safely removed. When the rescue basket finally carried him up through the darkness toward the waiting helicopter, he looked down one last time at the ravine that had nearly claimed all their lives. The wrecked bus sat silent in the beam of searchlights, its windows dark, its purpose fulfilled. It had been their shelter, their protection, their lifeline during the longest night of their lives. Now it would remain at the bottom of the ravine as a monument to their survival, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary vehicles could become the most extraordinary sanctuaries. As the helicopter carried him toward safety, Michael Torres reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 24 hours ago, He'd been just a bus driver, anonymous and invisible, content to remain in the background of other people's more important lives. The crash had stripped away that comfortable anonymity, forcing him to reclaim the leadership skills and survival instincts he'd thought he'd left behind with his military service. But more than that, it had reminded him of something fundamental about his own nature. He wasn't just Michael Torres, the bus driver, and he wasn't just Captain Torres, the retired Air Force officer. He was someone who stepped forward when people needed him, someone who took responsibility when lives were at stake, someone who refused to accept that any situation was hopeless as long as there were still people worth saving. The helicopter touched down at the medical staging area that had been established along the highway, where ambulances waited to transport the survivors to hospitals throughout the region. As Michael was helped out of the aircraft, he was immediately surrounded by paramedics, reporters, and officials who wanted to understand what had happened, how they had survived, and who was responsible for getting them through their ordeal. Dr. Victoria Ashworth was already being interviewed by a television crew, her voice steady and authoritative as she described the crash and their survival efforts. But when the reporter asked her who had taken charge during the crisis, her answer surprised everyone who heard it. "Captain Michael Torres," she said without hesitation. "If it hadn't been for his leadership, his military experience, and his refusal to give up on any of us, we would all be dead. He's not just a bus driver. He's the reason 43 people are going home to their families tonight." The reporters immediately turned their attention to Michael, but he had quietly disappeared into the crowd of rescue workers and medical personnel. He had no interest in interviews or accolades, no desire to be celebrated as a hero. His only concern was ensuring that every one of his passengers received appropriate medical care and was safely reunited with their families. Sophie Martinez found him near one of the ambulances, where he was checking on the condition of students as they were prepared for transport to various hospitals. Her father's compass was still in his hand, and she smiled when she saw him holding it. "You brought us all home, Captain," she said quietly. Michael handed the compass back to her. "We brought each other home, Sophie. That's what families do." As the last ambulance disappeared into the night, carrying its cargo of survivors toward healing and recovery, Michael Torres stood alone beside the empty highway. The snow had stopped falling, and stars were beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter was returning to base, its mission completed. In a few hours, the story would be all over the news. The miraculous survival of 43 people in a charter bus crash, the heroic actions of a former military pilot, the dramatic rescue operation that brought them all to safety. There would be interviews and investigations, commendations and ceremonies, all the machinery of modern media and bureaucracy grinding into motion around their story. But for now, there was only silence and stars and the satisfaction of knowing that everyone he'd been responsible for was alive. Michael Torres, bus driver and retired Air Force captain, had kept his promise to get them home safely. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. 3 months later, the spring air carried the scent of wildflowers through the open windows of Riverside Community Center, as Michael Torres sat in the back row of folding chairs, trying to remain invisible among the crowd of parents, teachers and local officials. The auditorium buzzed with excited conversation as people filed in for what the program listed as a special recognition ceremony, though Michael had been deliberately vague about the details when Maya had asked him why they needed to attend. His 12-year-old daughter fidgeted in the seat beside him, her school backpack balanced on her knees as she craned her neck to see over the adults in front of them. "Dad, why won't you tell me what this is about? And why are there so many reporters here?" Michael glanced toward the front of the room where several television crews were setting up their equipment, their bright lights already making the small auditorium uncomfortably warm. He'd tried to avoid this moment for weeks, declining interviews and refusing to participate in what the school district had initially planned as a much larger media event. But when Sophie Martinez had personally called to ask him to attend, her voice still carrying traces of the trauma they'd shared, he couldn't bring himself to disappoint her. "It's just a school thing, kiddo," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Maya was too perceptive to be fooled by such obvious deflection, a trait she'd inherited from her mother along with her stubborn curiosity and her ability to see through his attempts at protective deception. The murmur of conversation died as Dr. Victoria Ashworth approached the podium at the front of the auditorium. She looked different than she had in the ravine, her usual armor of expensive suits and calculated authority, replaced by something softer, more genuine. The experience had changed her in ways that went far beyond the obvious physical healing from minor injuries sustained in the crash. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for a very special occasion," she began, her voice carrying easily through the small auditorium. 3 months ago, 43 members of our school community faced a situation that no one should ever have to endure. What happened in those mountains tested every assumption we had about leadership, about heroism, and about what it means to put the welfare of others above your own safety. Maya turned to look at her father with growing understanding, noting the way his jaw had tightened and how his hands gripped the edge of his chair. "Dad, this is about you, isn't it?" Before Michael could answer, Mrs. Henderson rose from her seat in the front row and walked to the podium. Her silver hair caught the stage lights as she adjusted the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice carried the warm authority that had guided countless students through their musical education over the years. "I've been teaching for 35 years, she said, "and in that time I've learned to recognize different kinds of strength. There's the strength that comes from confidence, the strength that comes from preparation, and the strength that comes from fear transformed into determination. But the rarest kind of strength is the kind that emerges when someone discovers they have the power to save lives, and chooses to use that power even when it puts their own life at risk." The audience was completely silent now, drawn into the story that many of them had only heard through news reports and second-hand accounts. Michael found himself remembering the weight of the steering wheel in his hands, the terrible mathematics of momentum and gravity, the sound of Sophie's humming cutting through the chaos of their descent into the ravine. "Captain Michael Torres," Mrs. Henderson continued, using his military title with deliberate emphasis, "is not just the man who drove our bus that day. He's the reason that every student, every chaperone, every member of our school family came home alive. He's the reason that 43 families didn't have to plan funerals instead of graduation parties." Maya's eyes widened as the implications of Mrs. Henderson's words sank in. She turned to stare at her father with a mixture of pride and confusion, trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man who helped her with homework and made her breakfast every morning with the hero being described on stage.
The next speaker was Tommy Rodriguez, his arm no longer in a sling, but his voice still carrying the slight breathlessness that had lingered after his chest injuries healed. He walked to the podium with the confident stride of someone who had survived something terrible and emerged stronger. His tuba case nowhere in sight, but his presence filling the small auditorium with quiet dignity. "Captain Torres probably doesn't remember this," Tommy began, "but when I was in 7th grade, I was getting bullied pretty badly. Not just the usual stuff, but the kind of bullying that makes you think about not coming to school anymore. One day, Captain Torres saw what was happening in the parking lot after school. He didn't make a big scene or anything. He just walked over and asked if I needed help with my instrument case." Tommy paused, his voice thickening with emotion. That one simple question changed everything. Not because he solved my bullying problem with some dramatic intervention, but because he saw me as a person worth helping. When we were trapped in that ravine, bleeding and scared and convinced we were going to die, he did the same thing. He saw all of us as people worth saving, worth risking his life for. Michael felt heat creeping up his neck, the familiar discomfort of unwanted attention, combined with the deeper unease of having his private actions held up for public examination. This wasn't why he'd done any of it. He hadn't helped Tommy with his tuba case because he wanted to be seen as heroic.
He hadn't taken control in the ravine because he wanted recognition or praise. He'd simply done what needed to be done, what any decent person would have done in the same circumstances. Sarah Chen was the next to speak, her head wound completely healed, but a thin scar still visible along her hairline when the stage lights hit her at the right angle. She spoke about the moment when Michael had revealed his military background, how his calm competence had transformed a situation of pure terror into something that felt manageable, survivable. "There's a concept in psychology called learned helplessness," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind her words. "It's when people give up trying to change their circumstances because they believe they have no power to influence the outcome." In that ravine, we were all experiencing learned helplessness. We were convinced that we were going to die, that there was nothing anyone could do to change that outcome. She paused, looking directly at Michael despite his attempts to remain inconspicuous in the back row. Captain Torres didn't just refuse to accept that helplessness. He showed us that even in the worst possible circumstances, there are always choices to be made, always actions that can be taken. He taught us that survival isn't just about enduring whatever happens to you. It's about taking responsibility for making sure that everyone around you has the best possible chance of making it home. Maya reached over and took her father's hand, squeezing it tightly as she began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. She'd always known that her father was former military, but he'd never talked about his service in any detail. She'd assumed it was because nothing particularly interesting had happened, not because he was reluctant to discuss experiences that had shaped him in fundamental ways. Sophie Martinez was the last student to speak, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. She'd grown taller in the months since the accident, and there was a new confidence in her posture that spoke of someone who had faced her deepest fears and survived. "My father served 3 tours overseas," she began, "and he always told me that the hardest part of military service wasn't the danger or the discomfort, or even being separated from family. The hardest part was learning to live with the responsibility of other people's lives in your hands. He said that once you accept that responsibility, it never really goes away, even after you take off the uniform." She looked directly at Michael, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Captain Torres could have stayed anonymous forever. He could have just been our bus driver, someone who got paid to transport us from one place to another. But when we needed him to be more than that, when we needed someone to take responsibility for our lives, he didn't hesitate. He became the person we needed him to be. The applause that followed was subdued, respectful, rather than celebratory. This wasn't a sports victory or academic achievement being recognized, but something more fundamental and serious. Lives had been saved through extraordinary action, and the community was acknowledging that debt in the only way they knew how. Dr. Ashworth returned to the podium carrying a wooden plaque and what appeared to be an official certificate in a leather folder. "Captain Torres, would you please come forward?" Michael shook his head slightly, but Maya was already pulling him to his feet. "Dad, you have to go up there. They're trying to honor you." "I don't need to be honored," he said quietly. "I just did my job." "No," Maya said with the fierce certainty that only a 12-year-old can muster. "You saved 43 people. That's not just doing your job, that's being a hero." Reluctantly, Michael made his way to the front of the auditorium, acutely aware of the cameras tracking his movement and the hundreds of eyes focused on him. He'd been more comfortable in combat zones than he was in this small-town auditorium, more at ease flying damaged aircraft through hostile territory than standing on a stage being praised for actions he considered basic human decency. Ashworth handed him the plaque first, its brass surface engraved with words he didn't have time to read before she was speaking again. "This commendation comes from the Colorado Department of Education, recognizing extraordinary service to the students and families of our community. But more than that, it comes from 43 people who are alive today because you refused to accept that their situation was hopeless." The certificate was from the Colorado National Guard, signed by the Adjutant General and bearing official seals that meant nothing to most of the people in the audience but everything to Michael. It was a recognition from his military peers, an acknowledgement that his actions had upheld the highest traditions of service and sacrifice. But it was the third item that Dr. Ashworth presented that nearly broke his composure entirely. It was a simple envelope, hand-addressed and bearing no official markings. Inside was a letter written in a child's careful handwriting, signed by every student who had been on the bus that day. "Dear Captain Torres," the letter began, "we know you don't like being called a hero, but we want you to know that's what you are to us. Not because you're famous or because you got medals, but because when we needed someone to take care of us, you did. When we needed someone to be brave so we could be brave too, you were. When we needed someone to believe we could all make it home, you never stopped believing. We hope that when we grow up, we can be the kind of people who help others the way you helped us. Thank you for bringing us home. Thank you for showing us what courage looks like. Thank you for being our captain." Michael's hands shook as he folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. These children had given him something far more valuable than any official recognition, something that went to the heart of why he'd left his military career to become a father, and why he'd stepped forward in the ravine when leadership was needed. When Dr. Ashworth invited him to speak, Michael approached the microphone with visible reluctance. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the audience that included not just the survivors and their families, but members of the broader community who had followed their story through news reports and local conversations. 3 months ago, he began, his voice steady but quiet. "I was just a bus driver. That's not false modesty or an attempt to minimize what happened. That's simply the truth. I was someone whose job was to transport students safely from one location to another, and I took that responsibility seriously because someone's children were in my care." He paused, gathering his thoughts. What happened in the mountains didn't make me a hero. It just revealed something that was already there, something that exists in most people if they're put in the right circumstances. The willingness to put someone else's welfare ahead of your own safety isn't special or unusual, it's fundamental to what makes us human. Maya watched her father with growing admiration, beginning to understand not just what he had done, but who he was at his core. The man standing on stage was the same person who had helped her learn to ride a bicycle by running alongside her until she found her balance, who had sat up with her through countless nightmares after her mother left, who had made 1,000 small sacrifices to ensure that her childhood was stable and secure. The real heroes, Michael continued, are the students who kept each other calm during our descent into the ravine, the chaperones who helped treat injuries and maintain morale during our night in the wilderness, Mrs. Henderson, who volunteered to make a dangerous climb to help signal for rescue, Dr. Ashworth, who took charge of medical care and supplies management. Every person in that bus contributed to our survival in ways that were just as crucial as anything I did. He looked directly at Sophie Martinez, who was sitting in the front row with her father, a distinguished-looking man in a military dress uniform who had flown in from his current assignment to attend the ceremony. Sophie kept us focused on hope instead of fear through the simple act of humming a melody that reminded us we were still alive, still human, still connected to something beautiful despite our circumstances. That's not a small contribution, that's everything. The applause was warmer this time, recognition of Michael's attempt to share credit with everyone who had been part of their collective survival. But when the clapping died away, Dr. Ashworth had one more surprise. "Captain Torres, there's someone here who wants to meet you," she said, gesturing toward the side entrance of the auditorium. "Someone who's traveled quite a distance to be here today." Michael turned to see a man in Air Force dress blues entering the auditorium, his uniform bearing the insignia of a full colonel. As the officer approached, Michael's military training kicked in automatically, and he snapped to attention despite his civilian clothes and the informal setting. "At ease, Captain," the colonel said with a slight smile. I'm Colonel James Mitchell, current commander of the 437th Airlift Wing at Charleston. I believe you served with some of my personnel during your deployment rotations." Michael relaxed slightly, though his posture remained respectful. He recognized the wing designation, though he'd never served directly under this particular commander. "Yes, sir. It's an honor to meet you." Colonel Mitchell reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Captain Torres, it's my privilege to present you with the Airman's Medal, awarded for heroism involving voluntary risk of life under conditions other than those of conflict with an opposing armed force. Your actions in the Colorado mountains exemplified the finest traditions of the United States Air Force and brought great credit upon yourself and the service." The ceremony had taken an unexpectedly formal turn, but Michael accepted the medal with appropriate military bearing. The Airman's Medal was not awarded lightly, and receiving it from a serving colonel in front of his daughter and the community that had come to know him as simply a bus driver carried emotional weight that he hadn't anticipated. "There's one more thing," Colonel Mitchell continued. "The Air Force is always in need of experienced pilots for our Reserve and National Guard units. If you're ever interested in returning to active service, even on a part-time basis, I'd be happy to discuss opportunities that would allow you to continue serving while maintaining your civilian responsibilities." The offer hung in the air like an invitation to reclaim a part of himself that Michael had thought was permanently in his past. Flying again, even in a limited capacity, returning to the cockpit where his skills and experience could be put to use in service of something larger than himself. It was tempting in ways that surprised him with their intensity. But when he looked out at the audience and saw Maya watching him with pride and love, when he saw the students whose lives he'd helped save, and the community that had embraced him not as a decorated officer, but as someone who had simply done what needed to be done, Michael realized that his current life wasn't a retreat from service, but a different kind of service entirely. "Thank you, Colonel," he said. "That's a generous offer, and I'm honored by your confidence. But I think my place is here, with my daughter and this community. Sometimes the most important missions are the ones that don't require leaving home." The ceremony concluded with a reception in the adjoining room, where Michael found himself surrounded by people wanting to thank him, to share their own stories of crisis and survival, to connect with someone who had demonstrated that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary circumstances when called upon to do so. Maya stayed close to his side throughout the evening, clearly proud of her father but also protective of him in ways that touched Michael's heart. She had inherited more than just her mother's features and intelligence. She had also developed an intuitive understanding of when he was feeling overwhelmed by attention and needed gentle rescue from well-meaning admirers. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to thin, Sophie Martinez approached with her father, who had been waiting patiently for an opportunity to speak privately with Michael. Colonel Martinez was older than Michael, his uniform bearing the ribbons of multiple deployments and decades of distinguished service. "Captain Torres," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "I wanted to thank you personally for taking care of my daughter when I couldn't be there to protect her myself." Michael shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the direct gaze that marked a career military officer. "Sophie took care of herself, sir. She showed remarkable courage under extremely difficult circumstances. She told me about the humming," Colonel Martinez said with a slight smile, "about how you recognized what she was doing and encouraged the other students to join in. That kind of situational awareness, that ability to identify and reinforce positive coping mechanisms under stress, that's not something they teach in civilian emergency response training." Michael nodded, understanding the subtext. Military personnel recognized each other across the boundaries of service branches and time periods, sharing an understanding of leadership and responsibility that was difficult to explain to those who hadn't experienced it firsthand.
Sophie also told me, Colonel Martinez continued, that you gave her hope when she was convinced that they were all going to die. She said that your calm competence made it possible for her to believe that survival was possible, that someone was in control of the situation, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Your daughter is remarkable, Michael said.
Her strength helped everyone else find their own courage. Colonel Martinez smiled with obvious paternal pride. She wants to go to the Air Force Academy when she graduates from high school. Says she wants to learn to be the kind of leader who can take care of people the way you took care of her and her classmates. The conversation was interrupted by Maya tugging on Michael's sleeve, her 12-year-old patience finally exhausted by the lengthy adult interactions. "Dad, can we go home now? I have homework, and you promised we'd work on my science project tonight." Michael looked down at his daughter, noting the way she'd phrased her request. Not "I'm bored" or "I want to leave," but a gentle reminder of their shared responsibilities and commitments. She was giving him a graceful exit from a situation that had already stretched his comfort zone well beyond its normal limits. "Of course, kiddo. Let me just say goodbye to a few people." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Ashworth approached one final time. The transformation in her demeanor over the past 3 months had been remarkable, though Michael suspected that the changes went deeper than what was visible at public events like this one. "Michael," she said, using his first name with the easy familiarity that had developed between them during their shared ordeal, "I wanted you to know that the school board has approved funding for a new emergency response training program. We're going to teach all of our drivers and staff basic leadership and crisis management skills based on what we learned from our experience in the mountains." Michael nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a smart investment. Hopefully they'll never need to use those skills, but it's good to be prepared. We'd like you to help develop the curriculum," Dr. Ashworth continued. "Your practical experience with crisis leadership, combined with your military training, would be invaluable in creating a program that actually prepares people for the realities of emergency situations." It was another invitation to step forward, to take on additional responsibility and visibility within the community. Michael considered the offer carefully, weighing his natural inclination toward privacy against the potential value of sharing hard-won knowledge with people who might someday face similar challenges. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "It's important work, and if I can contribute something useful, I'd be willing to help." The drive home was quiet, Maya absorbed in her own thoughts as she processed everything she'd learned about her father during the evening's ceremony. Michael had always been reluctant to talk about his military service, deflecting her questions with vague references to flying transport planes and helping people get from one place to another. Now she was beginning to understand that his modest descriptions had concealed a much more complex and meaningful career. "Dad," she said as they pulled into their driveway, "why didn't you ever tell me that you were a hero?" Michael turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment, considering how to answer a question that went to the heart of how he saw himself and how he wanted his daughter to understand the world. "Because I'm not a hero, Maya," he said finally. "I'm just someone who's learned that when people need help, you help them. When they need someone to take charge, you take charge. When they need someone to believe that things will be okay, you find a way to believe it yourself so you can share that belief with them." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "But isn't that what heroes do? Help people, and take charge and make them feel safe?" "Maybe," Michael conceded. "But if that's true, then there are heroes all around us every day. Teachers who stay late to help struggling students. Doctors and nurses who work extra shifts to take care of sick people. Parents who sacrifice their own wants so their children can have what they need. People who volunteer at food banks and homeless shelters and community centers." He looked at his daughter in the dim light of the car's interior, noting the serious expression that meant she was thinking deeply about something important. "The point is, Maya, you don't have to wait for a disaster or an emergency to be the kind of person who helps others. You can choose to be that person every day, in small ways and large ways depending on what the situation requires."
Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned over to hug her father, a gesture that surprised him with its intensity and duration. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said simply. "Not just because you saved all those people, but because you're the kind of person who would do something like that. Because when I grow up, I want to be brave like you." As they walked toward their front door, Michael reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been content with his anonymous life as a bus driver, focused solely on providing stability and security for his daughter, while avoiding the kind of attention and responsibility that had defined his military career. The accident had forced him out of that comfortable anonymity, revealing aspects of his character and capabilities that he'd thought were safely buried in his past. But instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable, he found himself oddly at peace with the recognition and expectations that had come with it. Maybe Sophie Martinez had been right when she'd said that responsibility, once accepted, never really went away. Maybe his years of quiet service as a single father had been preparation for the moment when 43 lives would depend on his ability to lead under impossible circumstances. Or maybe, as he'd told Maya, heroism wasn't about extraordinary moments of crisis, but about the daily choice to put other people's welfare ahead of your own comfort, the choice to step forward when others stepped back, the choice to take responsibility when it would be easier to let someone else handle the difficult decisions. As Michael Torres tucked his daughter into bed that night, helping her with the science project they'd promised to work on together, he realized that his life had found a balance he hadn't known he was seeking. He was still a bus driver, still a single father, still someone who preferred quiet competence to public recognition. But he was also Captain Torres again when the situation required it, ready to accept responsibility and provide leadership when lives were at stake. The two identities weren't contradictory but complementary, different aspects of the same fundamental commitment to service and protection of others. Outside, the Colorado mountains rose against the starlit sky, their peaks dusted with snow that would melt and reform with the changing seasons. Somewhere in those mountains, a ravine held the remains of a charter bus that had become a symbol of survival against impossible odds. And in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, a man who had learned to be both ordinary and extraordinary slept peacefully, knowing that 43 people were alive because he had refused to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. The next morning would bring new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve, and new chances to demonstrate that heroism wasn't about fame or recognition, but about the simple willingness to help others when help was needed. Michael Torres, bus driver and captain, father and leader, was ready for whatever came next. 5 years had passed since that October morning when everything changed. Maya Torres, now 17 and preparing for her senior year, sat at the kitchen table grading papers for the emergency response training program her father had finally agreed to help develop. The program had expanded far beyond the original school district initiative, becoming a model for rural communities across Colorado and neighboring states. Michael entered the kitchen wearing his familiar flannel shirt and work boots, but now he also carried the quiet confidence of someone who had found peace with both sides of his identity. The emergency response training had become more than a side project. It had become his calling, a way to share the hard-won lessons of survival and leadership with people who might someday face their own impossible situations. "How many new instructors are we training this month?" Maya asked without looking up from the evaluation forms she was reviewing. 15, Michael replied, pouring himself coffee from the pot that had been brewing since dawn. 2 from fire departments, 3 from search and rescue units, and 10 civilian volunteers who want to learn crisis management skills for their communities. Maya smiled at the pride in her father's voice. The shy, reluctant hero who had once tried to avoid all attention had gradually transformed into someone who understood that his experiences could serve a larger purpose. not through fame or recognition, but through the quiet work of teaching others to recognize their own capacity for extraordinary action when circumstances demanded it. The phone rang, interrupting their morning routine. Michael answered with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to handling urgent calls at all hours. "Torres emergency training," he said, then paused as he listened to the voice on the other end. Maya watched her father's expression shift from casual attention to focused concern, noting the subtle changes in posture that indicated he was processing information about a developing crisis. "How many passengers?" he asked, then nodded grimly at the response. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Have them set up a command post at the highway junction, and make sure someone's coordinating with the National Weather Service about the storm track." Maya looked up from her papers as her father ended the call. Another training exercise. Michael shook his head as he reached for his jacket and emergency kit. Charter bus carrying a youth hockey team went off Interstate 70 about 40 miles from here. Early reports suggest they're trapped in a canyon, and there's another storm system moving in from the west. The familiar weight of responsibility settled over Michael's shoulders as he prepared to respond to someone else's crisis. But this time he wouldn't be alone with 43 terrified passengers and his own improvised survival skills. This time he would be part of a coordinated response team, working with trained professionals who had learned from his experiences and those of countless others who had faced similar challenges. Maya stood and grabbed her own jacket. "I'm coming with you." "Maya, this isn't a training session. This is real, and it could be dangerous." His daughter looked at him with the steady gaze she had inherited from both her parents, the expression of someone who had spent years watching her father balance his desire to protect her with his need to serve others. "Dad, I'm 17 years old. I've completed the same emergency response training as your other instructors, and I've learned from the best teacher in Colorado how to stay calm under pressure and help other people when they're scared." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Besides, if there are kids trapped in that canyon, they might respond better to someone closer to their own age than to a bunch of adults in official uniforms." Michael considered his daughter's argument, weighing his protective instincts against the recognition that she was no longer the 12-year-old who had needed to be shielded from difficult truths. Maya had grown up in the shadow of his story, understanding from an early age that sometimes ordinary people were called upon to do extraordinary things. She had absorbed those lessons not through dramatic speeches or formal instruction, but through years of watching him quietly serve others. "All right," he said finally, "but you stay with the command team unless I specifically assign you to a different role, and if conditions become too dangerous, you follow evacuation orders without argument." Maya nodded seriously, understanding that her father's conditions weren't arbitrary restrictions, but the kind of safety protocols that had kept 43 people alive during their ordeal in the ravine. As they drove toward the accident site, Maya reflected on how her life had been shaped by her father's reluctant heroism. She had watched him struggle with unwanted attention, seen him gradually accept that his experiences could serve a larger purpose, and learned that true leadership wasn't about seeking recognition, but about accepting responsibility when lives were at stake. The highway was already busy with emergency vehicles when they arrived, their flashing lights creating a kaleidoscope of red and blue against the gray morning sky. Michael parked near the mobile command unit and immediately integrated himself into the response team, his quiet competence earning immediate respect from incident commanders who had heard his story, but were now seeing his professional skills firsthand. Maya found herself assigned to the family liaison area, where parents and relatives of the trapped hockey players were gathering for updates on the rescue operation. Her role was to provide information, emotional support and practical assistance to people who were living through their own version of the nightmare her father had experienced years earlier. The rescue operation took 14 hours, Unlike the improvised survival situation Michael had faced in the ravine, this effort involved helicopters, specialized equipment, trained medical personnel, and coordinated communication between multiple agencies. But at its heart it still came down to individual people making difficult decisions under extreme pressure, refusing to accept that any situation was hopeless as long as there were still lives to be saved. All 28 members of the hockey team and their coaches were successfully evacuated from the canyon. Several required medical treatment for injuries and exposure, but everyone survived. As the last helicopter lifted off carrying the final rescue personnel, Michael found himself standing at the edge of the canyon, looking down into the darkness where another group of young people had faced their own test of survival and courage. Maya joined him at the canyon rim, both of them exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. "Think they'll remember this the way your passengers remember what happened in the ravine?" she asked. Michael considered the question, thinking about the letters he still received from Sophie Martinez, now a cadet at the Air Force Academy, and Tommy Rodriguez, who had become a paramedic in Denver, about Sarah Chen, who was studying emergency medicine, and Mrs. Henderson, who had developed her own wilderness survival program for educators. "They'll remember that when everything seemed hopeless, people showed up to help them," he said. "They'll remember that there are adults who risk their own safety to protect children, even children who aren't their own. And hopefully they'll carry that knowledge with them when they're the ones who have to decide whether to step forward or step back." As they drove home through the early morning darkness, Maya dozed in the passenger seat while Michael reflected on the strange path that had led him from anonymous bus driver to reluctant hero to emergency response trainer. He had learned that heroism wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a series of small choices, daily decisions to put other people's welfare ahead of your own comfort. The next morning brought new requests for training programs, new opportunities to share the lessons learned in moments of crisis, new chances to help others discover their own capacity for courage under impossible circumstances. Michael Torres, bus driver and captain, father and teacher, had found his true calling in the space between ordinary and extraordinary, helping others understand that the difference between the two was often just a willingness to act when action was needed most. In the end, that was all heroism had ever been. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. Not special powers or unique abilities, but the simple recognition that sometimes, when people need help, you help them. And sometimes, when 43 lives depend on your refusal to give up, that simple recognition is enough to bring everyone home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.